are you? Welcome to the Classic English Literature Podcast. This is the show that tries to make tweed jackets with leather elbow patches cool again. Make tweed cool again! That's our slogan. I thought that today we'd head back to the theater. It's been a while since we had our pots boiled with a really sensational revenge tragedy, full of blood and madness and intrigue. Well, John Webster's 1614 curtain shredder, the Duchess of Malfi, that's such a pot boiler that you could make your plum pudding in it. Perhaps I do dear John an injustice. I don't mean to imply that this play is just a bit of hack work, because it's actually a great work of art. But it also includes some real Gothic, even almost film noir elements. You got secret, scandalous marriages. You got spies, murders, evil churchmen, and apricots. Yes, evil apricots, the most lascivious of all pitted fruits. But before we nibble at such forbidden fruits, I'd like to give a shout out to a great friend of the show. In fact, a great friend full stop. Thank you so much, Dada Drew, for your very generous gift. Drew was a teaching colleague of mine at a Catholic prep school for a number of years, and in addition to being an inspiring teacher, and maybe the most brilliant mind I've ever met, he is one of maybe two of the most cherished friends I've ever had. Thank you, dear sir, and God bless you and yours.
Why, thank you.
Have any of you seen the movie Shakespeare in Love? Came out in 1998, I believe. It's a fictional account of a young Will Shakespeare struggling to write Romeo and Juliet, being inspired by and falling in love with a young woman who has disguised herself as a man, naturally, so she can audition for the theater. It's a pretty good movie, and I commend it to you if you've not seen it. Anyway, I bring it up because there's a curious scene involving a rather grimy young boy who passes his days feeding live mice to alley cats. Shakespeare asks the little urchin about his favorite play, Titus Andronicus, which is probably Shakespeare's most cruel and certainly his grossest drama. The boy replies, "I like it when they cut their heads off. And the daughter mutilated with knives, plenty of blood, that's the only writing." We can imagine such a boy today, skulking in his parents' basement in a black leather trench coat, playing some first-person shooter game and slurping energy drinks. Now, after Romeo and Juliet premieres, the boy gives it a thumbs up, offering this review. "I liked it when she stabbed herself. What a charming child." At any rate, this gruesome little gutter snipe is John Webster, and those moviegoers who recognized the name had a little knowing chuckle at the joke, for his plays featured just the kind of violence that this young cherub so approved of. It should be said, for legal reasons perhaps, that this scene is purely the fanciful creation of screenwriter Tom Stoppard, and it's included as an Easter egg for Elizabethan eggheads. And I should also say that my rather cavalier comparison of the young John Webster to a gamer-gating incel was a manufactured calumny intended only to raise a cheap smirk. So my apologies to any of Mr. Webster's descendants who may be listening and who have been mortified at my quip. Now, truth is, though, we don't really know much about the life of our friend John Webster. We've only got the bleached and incomplete skeleton of facts. He was born somewhere around 1580 in London's Newgate area, in the auspiciously named parish of St. Sepulchre. He was probably the son of a carriage maker who was in the Merchant Tailors Guild. His mom was probably a blacksmith's daughter. And the boy likely attended the Merchant Tailors Guild school. He drops away for some 18 years when we get a record from the Middle Temple, that's one of the Inns of Court, that they had admitted a John Webster lately of the New Inn, and this may well have been our man. At the age of 25, he married the 17-year-old Sarah Peniel, whom he had gotten up the duff 7 months earlier, and their child rejoiced in the name of John Webster III. Now, our playwright, he may have died in 1632, but he had certainly gone to that great after-party in the sky by 1634, since fellow playwright Thomas Heywood's Hierarchy of the Blessed Angels from that year, it mentions Webster, but only in the past tense. Beyond that, we really only know of his professional activities, maybe a bit of acting, certainly a good deal of writing, and the kind of writing that gloried in the depiction of bloodshed from which Stoppard so whimsically extrapolated his film's blithely cruel street urchin. Despite writing perhaps a dozen plays and enjoying a good reputation in his time, Webster is now remembered for really only 2 tragedies, White Devil of 1611 and our play, The Duchess of Malfi, from 3 years later. Both are rather macabre, and they're both based on real events in Italian history. Now, given their rather gruesome portrayals of human cruelty, Webster fell out of favor by the beginning of the 18th century and was all but forgotten in the 19th. But following the horrors of the first half of the 20th century, Webster's vision of a doomed humanity gained purchase, and his 2 major tragedies have enjoyed a vigorous performance schedule since first being resurrected in 1945. So, The Duchess of Malfi by John Webster. Splendidly dark, enthralling Jacobean tragedy, positively drips with intrigue and malice. So, dear listener, allow me to whisk you through this Baroque drama with the flourish it so richly deserves. Yes, that's right. It's time for the quick and dirty. The play opens with the Duchess of Malfi, a widow who secretly marries her steward Antonio. This bold act defies the social conventions of the time, particularly given that her brothers, Ferdinand and the Cardinal, are vehemently opposed to her remarrying. They believe it tarnishes the family name and jeopardizes their political ambitions. What they don't say is that it also bothers their rather incestuous desire for her. The Duchess's secret is eventually uncovered, and her brother's wrath is unrelenting. Ferdinand has hired a man named Basola, a disaffected former servant. He becomes a spy and an assassin, and he's to uncover the Duchess's secrets.
Are you ready to embark on a journey of self-discovery and empowerment? Join us on the Mindfully Gay podcast, where we, Jerry Bowie, John Cottrell, and Nick Walton, dive deep into the heart of queer identity.
We explore what it means to live authentically in today's world. Whether we're discussing the concept of queer spirit, sharing our coming out stories, or navigating the complexities of gay friendships and family dynamics.
Our podcast is more than just conversation. It's a space where vulnerability meets strength and where we celebrate the unique contributions of the LGBTQ+ community.
Tune in to the Mindfully Gay podcast on your favorite platform.
Bring about her ruin. He does so by the cunning device of feeding her apricots, which were thought to bring about the labor of pregnancy. Oh, she eats those apricots, blissfully unaware of the full extent of the threat she faces, though she is initially happy with her new children. She eventually has 3 in secret, which does lead one to question Basola's effectiveness as an informer and his wisdom in choosing pitted fruit as his weapon. Nonetheless, Basola's investigations eventually reveal the Duchess's secret life. As Ferdinand's jealousy and madness escalate, he becomes obsessed with her, and the cardinal plays a duplicitous game, pretending to be the concerned brother while secretly plotting her downfall. During a supposed pilgrimage suggested to the Duchess by the Janist-faced Basola, man, she is so naive. The Duchess is arrested and imprisoned in a dark and horrifying dungeon. In a deeply tragic and poignant moment, she's forced to confront the horrors of her captivity. Ferdinand pretends to show her Antonio's severed hand with the ring on it, as well as his corpse and the corpse of her son. And then she's treated to a parade of lunatics, which is a rather retrograde presentation of the mentally ill, it must be said, but it's designed to have the Duchess join their ranks to drive her mad. But it turns out Antonio and the boy are not dead. Ferdinand had only put some waxwork figures in a cell. Good joke! Ferdinand, driven to the brink of madness, orders the murder of the Duchess and her children. And it's on stage. It's not tastefully off stage, as less lurid playwrights might have it. No, Webster's got these grim executioners, and they're strangling the life from our titular character. And as the play nears its tragic conclusion, the aftermath of the Duchess's death unfolds. Basola, racked with guilt and remorse, and having accidentally murdered Antonio, confronts the cardinal and Ferdinand. His role in the Duchess's tragedy weighs heavily on his conscience, and it leads him to this dramatic confrontation. Ferdinand and the cardinal meet their grim ends, having been undone by their own treachery and moral corruption. Basola ultimately seeks some measure of redemption, but of course his death too is inevitable. A friend of Antonio's enters, his name's Delio, and he comes in with the couple's other son. And the play ends with the implication that this boy will become the Duke of Malfi and all just order will be restored. I forgot to mention, before he dies, Ferdinand turns into a werewolf. Yeah, well, not like literally, but we get this ripping scene of him imagining that he's a wolf. And we hear tell of his howling at the moon and desecrating graves, scratching at fleas, and blowing down the houses of neighboring pigs. Well, only some of that's true. Well, there you go, Litterbugs. How's that for a ripping yarn? You see why Shakespeare in Love was able to make that little joke about the weird John Webster? Well, let's talk about Webster's sources for this most subtle of plays. As I said earlier, the story was, as they say, inspired by true events. In 1498, at the age of 19, one Giovanna d'Aragona, Duchess of Amalfi, having married her steward Antonio of Bologna and bearing him 3 children. 3 children by 19? They must have been at it like rabbits. Well, she's widowed in 1498, and rumors abound that her 2 brothers then murder her for sullying a noble family by this common marriage. But they were never formally accused, and they died quite natural deaths. The story gets picked up by a fella named Matteo Bandello, who tells it in his novella of 1554. Now, it's likely that Bandello knew Antonio of Bologna personally, so this account carries a pretty good deal of authority. The French writer François de Belforest adapts Bandello's Histoire tragique in the same volume that, incidentally, contains a source for Shakespeare's Hamlet. And then in 1567, Englishman William Painter includes the tale in a collection called The Palace of Pleasure. But what sets the source material apart from Webster's tragedy is its forthright didactic nature. Belforest and Painter especially see the Duchess as a moral degenerate for having married beneath her class. Now, That's despite the fact that the trope of a common man marrying a noblewoman was the staple of medieval romance literature, especially in the work of the Provençal troubadour poets. Despite this, the cultural stereotype of the widow as whore dominated the Renaissance imagination. Like Hamlet's vituperations against his mother Gertrude are really only the most famous example. In 1592, there's a translation of Juan Luis Vives' The Education of Christian Woman, and this condemns the lusty widow. He argues that sex in widowhood, even if legitimized by remarriage, it's still a betrayal of her wedding vows, for her husband is, quote, still alive with the life of the soul. And this evidences the persistence of St. Jerome's misogynistic charges that Chaucer so pleasingly mocked with his character Alison of Bath. You all remember that episode. In an early meeting between the Duchess and her brothers, Ferdinand articulates this prevailing wisdom. He says, quote, they are most luxurious will wed twice. The Duchess offers what she no doubt sees as a witty riposte. She says, quote, diamonds are of most value, they say, that have passed through most jewelers' hands. But Ferdinand cuts her down. Whores, by that rule, are precious. Well, then the Duchess protests too much, saying she will never remarry. The Cardinal, sounding like the embittered Hamlet, rejoins, quote, so most widows say, but commonly that motion lasts no longer than the turning of an hourglass. The funeral sermon and it end both together. So it seems that widows are like hunting dogs. Once they get the taste of blood, they're henceforth insatiable. So you got to collar them. At the start of Webster's play, we do get a clear presentation of male anxieties about the sex-starved woman of a certain age, and we might think that what will follow, as indeed it does in the sources, is this morally edifying story about a slutty dowager who gets what's coming to her. And Webster's version does present the Duchess's death as a consequence of her marriage. But, Webster fails to present the character of a libidinous wanton. I think only the most blue-nosed moralist would find the Duchess sexually rapacious or even immoderate. Arguably, the worst sin she commits is lying to her brothers in the above-quoted conversation when she tells them, will you hear me? I will never marry. Some scholars see in this fib evidence that Webster intends the audience to regard the Duchess with ambivalence, that she's not actually a fully moral human being, and we should be wary of sympathizing with her. But I'm not really convinced. I'm not sure how much of a lie that line actually is. It seems to me that it's just a way of telling her bullying brothers to back the hell off. And that's something I would, in fact, sympathize with. But on the other hand, we should not make the critical mistake, as it seems many modern readers would like to, of seeing in the Duchess of Malfi some kind of proto-feminist martyr story. Now, that reading goes something like this. A woman who remains unnamed, right? We only know her by her title. This woman inherits political and economic power upon the death of her husband. And as she's still young, beautiful, and clever, her brothers, who are emblems of traditional masculine power, Ferdinand represents the state and the cardinal represents the church, they see her as a threat to patriarchal hegemony. And so they marshal the forces of their privilege, physical and ideological privilege, mind you. They marshal those forces against her. However, she sidesteps these institutional barriers. So, for instance, look at the scene of her proposal and marriage to Antonio. The Duchess is the one who instigates the proceedings. She asks him. And indeed, Antonio appears kind of pretty weedy and dull-witted, actually. I don't know what she sees in him. She gets a bit frustrated with him at one point and says, quote, "The misery of us that are born great. We are forced to woo because none dare woo us, and as a tyrant doubles with his words and fearfully equivocates, so we are forced to express our violent passions in riddles and in dreams and leave the path of simple virtue, which was never made to seem the thing it is not." I think this speech could be called the Sadie Hawkins lament if Miss Hawkins had been gorgeous and rich. The Duchess complains that her nobility intimidates suitors, and so she must take matters into her own hands. But she's got to do so on the sly. She's got to be cunning about it. And this, ironically, kind of confirms the anti-woman stereotypes of the time about how women were immodest and duplicitous. But I think you can easily substitute the word women for the word great in that speech's first line. And the sentiment would still ring true, right? If she started, "The misery of us that are born women," it still works in the play. Then the marriage ceremony itself is almost entirely extra institutional. I guess that's the word. There's no priest, there's no church, there's no flowers, no documents. Only the vows between Antonio and the Duchess, which are witnessed by Cariola, the handmaid. And so the Duchess reminds us that, quote, "Lawyers say a contract in a chamber per verba de presente is absolute marriage. Bless heaven, this sacred Gordian, which let violence never untwine." And Antonio replies, "That we may imitate the loving palms, best emblem of a peaceful marriage that never bore fruit divided." And then the Duchess wonders, what can the church force more? So, while there is a kind of nod to orthodoxy, right? She does cite the opinions of anonymous lawyers. The marriage is remarkable for its disregard of social form. It is private, not public, and therefore beyond the scope, as the lovers believe it, of church and state. However, we should note that the Duchess's callow reference to their marriage as a Gordian knot is pretty tricky, right? Fans of Greek legend will know the story of that knot. It was so tangled and intricate that it was said that anyone who could undo it would rule all of Asia. And then Alexander the Great comes stamping along and he just hacks it through with his sword. The Duchess does not foresee the brute violence that will undo their lover's knot. Anyway, though, they rush off to bed to get started on that rabbiting. So it seems like we have a powerful woman just, living her best life, leaning into her best self. So take that, patriarchy. But at the end, right, she's murdered for her transgressions of gender, punished, one might say, by a threatened phallocentric power structure. Her son, notably, it's got to be a son, assumes the dukedom, and all is once again right with the world. So that's the political fable most often applied to this play today. And it's applied to many, many other texts too. And while I in no way disavow it, as far as it goes, it's perfectly cogent and accurate. It works. But it, like many readings that apply an extra literary interpretive paradigm, it runs the risk of ignoring, or at least diminishing, the Duchess of Malfi as a literary, as an artistic text. Questions of character development or dramatic structure, versification, imagery, and symbolism, they're all subjugated to an overriding social or political position. And the problem I have with that is that at some point, literature ceases to be a distinct form of cultural expression, and instead it's reduced to merely a cultural artifact. Here's what I mean by that. So, beginning in the 1960s in Europe, especially in France, and then blossoming in the United States throughout the last couple of decades of the 20th century, A movement broadly called critical theory took root in academic literary studies. A focus on various political and philosophical theories displaced the previous critical method, which focused on the aesthetic and formal and linguistic theories in studying literary texts. Again, broadly speaking, scholars and critics concentrated less on the traditional compositional aspects of literature and more on what texts revealed about the economic, gender, racial, or power assumptions of the society in which the poem or novel or play was produced and consumed. So readers began looking for evidence of classism, misogyny, racism, and colonialism, heteronormativity. They started looking for these ideas in literature in nearly the same way a sociologist or anthropologist would do when studying laws or advertising, economic policies, folkways, and other non-literary artifacts. For these scholars, a poem is no different than a diary entry, a civil statute, an editorial, or even a shopping list, because all of these things can tell us something about what it was like to live in a particular society at a particular time. And again, allow me to say, I think there's great value in the creation of such knowledge. The trouble is that at some point, we are left with essentially no new understanding from that new knowledge. At some point, to argue that the Duchess of Malfi presents and reinforces an anti-woman attitude in early modern English or European society is not really to argue anything at all. Essentially, all such critical approaches amount to, in the end, saying that this text reflects the beliefs of its time. Well, no kidding. All texts do that. And so do family structures and religious values and economic activities and political organization. The question that remains for me, then, is why did John Webster or Amelia Lanier or William Shakespeare, why did they bother to reflect their society in this particular and rather demanding fashion? Why write poetry or drama if all that matters is the slogan, the chant for marching in the streets? Why compose a sonnet cycle when a tweet will do? There must be more to this writing than is captured in critical theory's sometimes tacit assumption that a text is a text is a text is a text, and that a blog post has no essential difference from a screenplay. So I think it's imperative that conscientious readers attend to the formal elements of literature as literature, while not necessarily ignoring that literature's social or political origins and implications. I mean, indeed, I'm doing a historically oriented podcast about literature. While Webster's play does indeed present us with cruel examples of misogyny and the frustrations of middle and lower class characters, it's not simply a proto-Marxist feminist polemic. Note how carefully Webster constructs his tragedy, how he doubles scenes and plot points and characterizations. So Ferdinand and the Cardinal, for instance, are really both sides of the same coin. Ferdinand is splenetic and wrathful, and he's prone to emotional overreactions. He's brutal and violent. Contrastingly, the Cardinal is shrewd. He's cool and calculating. He's an amoral malevolence, and he chides his turbulent brother, quote, "You fly beyond your reason," and calling out the other's unruly outbursts as idle rage and intemperate noise. The Cardinal himself points out that he can, quote, "be angry without this rupture. There is not in nature a thing that makes man so deformed, so beastly, as doth intemperate anger." Now this charge that anger robs you of your reason, that deforms humanity, that renders humanity beast-like, it's really an artistic foreshadowing, because this charge of beastliness and deformity will reemerge later when Ferdinand growls and drools as a werewolf, a creature sans reason. Or we can look to the death scenes of the Duchess and Cariola. The former dies with aristocratic dignity. When Ferdinand offers her their father's dagger early in the play so that she can end her own life, she says, "For know whether I am doomed to live or die, I can do both like a prince." And then at the actual execution scene before she dies, her concern is not for herself, but for the welfare of her children. She says, quote, "I pray thee, look thou givest my little boy some syrup for his cold, and let the girl say her prayers ere she sleep." And then, as the executioners wrap the cords around her neck, she directs them, quote, "Pull, and pull strongly, for your able strength must pull down heaven upon me." That is dignity. That is grace under pressure, Ernest. But when they come for her maidservant, Cariola, quite understandably, she panics, right? And she bawls the objections to her death. She claims that she's engaged to a young gentleman. "You can't kill me. You can't kill me because I have some information about treason. I can tell the Duke. Don't kill me because I haven't received my last rites and I could be damned. You can't kill me because I'm pregnant." Her death lacks the stoic dignity of her mistresses. It's really understandable that she keeps coming up with these ways out, but the contrast Webster creates, it elevates both the pathetic horror of Cariola's murder and the nobility of the Duchess's death. Or we can look at Julia, the paramour of both the cardinal and the spy Basola. She's a woman caught between her own ambition and her own frustration, and the treachery of the men who claimed to advance it. Now, such ambition in contrasting ways, too, it animates the actions of Antonio and Basola. They're both trying to get ahead in this world in their own way, but they approach the moral quandaries that are predicated on their social positions in radically different ways. All of these contribute to a carefully crafted literary experience, a meditation on themes of human integrity, the corruption of power, the Machiavellian deployment of deceit. And we should be paying attention, too, to Webster's use of symbolism, like especially the ring. The word ring appears repeatedly in this play and in very different contexts, but they all begin to weave together. So he talks about it as a piece of military training apparatus. So like horsemen who were training to use the lance would try to pierce a ring on a post. And so we've got that idea, who got the ring. And then it's also used as a vulgar pun on female genitals, like, who got the ring? We also, of course, get it as the wedding ring, the token of love and commitment. And it's also the endless circle, the archetype of eternity. And Webster also uses it as a hangman's noose. And each time the word ring carries with it not only its proximal meaning, that is, what the speaker actually intends with that sentence at that moment, but it also carries with it all of the other associations and connotations that have come before or will come later. So each time we hear the word ring, its definition snowballs. It acquires more layers as the tragedy reaches its climax. And furthermore, if we wanted to push it, we could say we see some of John Donne's metaphysical conceit in Basola's use of the word geometry. See, the spy has spent years as a slave in the galleys for a murder he committed at the cardinal's behest, and he's been denied restitution or reward for his suffering and service. He grumbles that, quote, "There are rewards for hawks and dogs when they have done us service, but for a soldier that hazards his limbs in a battle, nothing but a kind of geometry is his last supportation." "Well, what do you mean by that?" asks Delio. And Basola explains, "To hang in a fair pair of slings, take his latter swing in the world upon an honorable pair of crutches from hospital to hospital." So we get the image of a man on crutches, a man who's been wounded in war, as like a hinge, and he's just swinging his way through the world from hospital to hospital until he dies. And the Duchess, in fact, echoes this conceit just before she dies. She claims that, quote, I know death hath 10,000 several doors for men which take their exits, and 'tis found they go on such strange geometrical hinges you may open them both ways. So Webster's use of this metaphor, this conceit, indicates an aesthetic and thematic intent on his part. And the fact that Basola speaks in a frustrated prose while the Duchess does so in a stately pentameter underscores the artistic construction of the text in ways that simply do not obtain in non-literary forms of expression. Sometimes students will ask me something like, if Macbeth is just about how ambition corrupts people, then why didn't Shakespeare just say that? And my quick answer is usually, well, would you have remembered it if he had? What I mean by that is, like, a glib proverb goes in easily, but it goes out just as easily. If he had just said, boy, power corrupts you, no one would be talking about that play 400 years later. Because you're not required to think about those kinds of ideas. You're only required to agree with them, and then you move on with your life. You don't need to chew them over because they've already been digested for you. The less quick answer is that the notion that ambition corrupts people is not, in fact, what the play is about. As far as social commentary goes, Shakespeare's plays are not about anything. There is no glib proverb that sums up the organic complexity and unity of his work. If anything can be said about what separates great art, enduring art, from more ephemeral art, it's that great art provides not answers or arguments, but it provides experiences. The critical and thoughtful observer notes the quality of experience as it might be revealed in the artist's intentions and execution, in the conventions of the particular art form or the absence of them, and of course in the position of the audience. That experience then becomes a locus for contemplation, for reflection, for exploration. And these have no endpoint. They are perpetually fruitful and subject to reevaluation and recombination. So, for instance, John Webster's The Duchess of Malfi was performed in the Blackfriars Theatre, England's first purpose-built indoor playhouse. Because performances were indoors, the environment could be controlled. Lighting effects, especially, could be used to enhance the performance in ways impossible in open-air venues like the Globe. So Webster wrote with this in mind. He had a vision for the audience's experience of this shadowy, mysterious, looming story. To me, the play portrays an experience of ignorance and frustration, of watching people grasp for something just beyond the limits of possibility. However, that possibility is delineated by sex or class or frailty or ignorance. The Duchess is grasping for true love and human dignity. Her brothers for a power no longer guaranteed men in a changing world. Basola's for respect and recognition in that world's amoral, naturalistic structure. Webster, unlike the authors of his sources, makes no neat and tidy statement about frustration. He offers no advice about ignorance. He artfully presents them so that we too can subject our experience to the meditative examination. And that's why, I think, The Duchess of Malfi still draws audiences, while the works of Bandello and Belforest and Painter have receded from the popular imagination. Thus endeth the lesson. I hope you found this experience both entertaining and edifying. And if you did, please take a couple of minutes to post a 5-star review of the potty on your favorite podcast platform so more listeners can be made aware of it. That, and telling anyone you know how much you enjoy the sterling work done here at the Classic English Literature Podcast, is the best way for us to grow. If you're in a giving mood, consider clicking the Support the Show button and making a financial gift. It's absolutely not tax deductible, but it would help immensely to keep the show going. Thank you very much for all your kind support. Ta-ta for now. Until next time, keep yourself marvelously well.